Lord, we ask for your blessings right now as we sum up this particular chapter and glean from it. Obviously now being introduced into what is our future, but maybe our present. Very likely it is our present situation right now, waiting to be revealed, Lord, ultimately in full when you remove the church from where it is at right now, which is in the last, very likely, days preceding the closing of the 7-year period marked out in the weeks that Daniel was prophesying against, or for. We know that we were given a revelation of that which has proven to be timely on timeline. The years that were converted to days, that were marched back to the time historically that they were spoken, bringing us into Jerusalem, the day in which Messiah, your Son, was presented to your people. That upon challenge of get your disciples to muzzle it, to quiet down, the Lord said even these rocks would cry out. Perhaps prophecy, trying to dial things in, but help us to just take it at faith value, record what we can, and endeavor to study as we might. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So Antichrist right now being voiced as we left off, like this. 36, I will pick it up. He's going to do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished, for what has been determined shall be done. So this simply tells us that in his personality, Antichrist, he is going to do what he wants. He will exalt and magnify himself. That means basically doing all the press. That basically means he's going to be his own PR agent. Okay, he's going to be everything good about himself. He will employ. He will be his own management team. In politics today, we actually see teams of people that support presidents, but they don't come up with the clever lines. They don't come up with the clever ads. They've got an entourage of people that work for that. This guy will have those skills. He'll be able to lay out an entire table of what he wants to project as an image to the people, and they'll go, this is magnificent. We've never seen anything like this. This is awesome. When will your sale go on for that book? When was the movie coming out that you were producing? Oh, that's awesome. And so everything will be on what he has done and making things snap and pop because he has that kind of gifting. Some of you are like that. You can do a lot of things. I can't. I'm vulnerable and I need gifts and talents that I can't. I know the vision, but I can't make it happen. I have to have people in my life that actually make that happen. Antichrist will be that visionary, and he'll be the one that makes it happen. And he will be able to catch up people to multiply that effectiveness. So that tells you what kind of mind he will have. Notice this that says above every god. Now this is important, because guess what? There are a lot of nations on the global front that have gods, right? So we focus on the central person of the Godhead, which is Jesus Christ. And he is Lord of Lords. He is King of Kings. He is Messiah, yet to be acknowledged by the Jewish people. But there's none other that can compare to him. But in this culture, perhaps even at this time, there are multiple gods overseeing multiple nationalities. And this guy has to make it one central God. He's going to do whatever it takes to appease the worship of gods, while at the same time bringing something in that ultimately will satisfy all of them. And the only way he can do that is to magnify himself impressively above all of them. Every God. But then it says in verse 36 that he is one who speaks blasphemy ultimately against the Lord God. This means he's going to be profaning the God of Israel, the God of the Christian. Notice this. If he's doing that, if he's profaning the Christian God, if he's profaning the Jewish God, how can he get away with it if we are here? He can't get away with it if we're here. He can get away with it if we're not here. So that brings us into Revelation. We'll look into it. And in chapter 4, following it, beginning chapter 5, there's silence. There's nothing that is being said with regard to the church, because it isn't 4 where there's this summary. There's this command. Come on up is the word that you'll see. And that equates to what is the Latin version of that word, raptus, in which the church is being called up. So that's cool, because that tells us that as far as our part of it, it ends there until the Lord brings us back into the latter chapters of Revelation as his glorified bride. And however you want to picture it, it's probably very unlikely. The fact of the matter, the fact is that we'll be following the Lord, and everything that's accomplished in our return as he reintroduces himself, however it looks, coming from heaven on horses. I don't get the imagery. I mean, maybe if it's in Humvees or Mustang cars that just, are powered. But the other, it's more difficult for me. But when the Lord comes back, it's the exclamation mark of him being the creator of the universe and ultimately the subduer of all that impose themselves and exalt themselves against him. We're part of it, but we're not going to have blood on our robes. It's just not going to be that way. It's not the battle of any battle that's ever been waged before. It's going to be cleanly fought and over in the voicing of one word that comes from his mouth and the fire from his eyes. So I say that because as we move through this, he will endeavor and shall prosper in all his ways. Very impressive. When men in political positions prosper, guess what? People subordinate to that man prosper. That's why one of the things right now, arguable only on politics, is how can you argue about the roaring of an economy and the things that have been accomplished in just about almost 3.5 years, in what one man who should have had absolutely no ability to corner the market, corner politics, influence literally the deep, oppressive recession and stuff that was going on. How could that possibly be? I personally believe, not knowing exactly the outcome in November, and I don't, but when evaluation that's properly done about what's happened in 3.5 years, I do not believe any president in our country and our notable history of presidencies has ever been able to do it. How's that possible? I've only been able to attribute it to one thing. This guy marched in completely without the corruption of politics or how they play the game. And one of the first things he did was introduce before the nation something like 16 pastors and teachers and a rabbi, and he made no allowance for Islam to be voiced or any pagan religion to be acknowledged. That's the only thing I can determine. The only thing that to me determines what has happened is because of that. But what I say is that what we have seen, in my opinion, is God blessing a nation, because he found a man that, even though his personality is interesting, really not, it's not difficult to me, just an interesting personality, not so diplomatic, speaks his mind, has challenges with using proper English, calls people's names. He's kind of a classic bully. But I think God says, yeah, I'm going to bring somebody in. He's going to kick a little keister. He's going to change some attitudes. He's going to affect a direction that I want in order to stop the infection of sin. So, every president had reservation to do what he did. Yeah, the embassy's going to go to Jerusalem. It immediately changed the game plan, because it immediately said the most powerful nation, inarguably, on the face of the earth is the United States, and we're saying that's their country. And all of a sudden we began to say, oh, by the way, any portion of your country that you want to annex or take over, it's yours. I'm not going to try to work something out with the Palestinians. They've been pretty objectionable, pretty unreasonable. So, Benjamin, take it over and we'll support you. And that's basically what we've seen. And that means this. With what we've seen God do right now, Antichrist will be able to impersonate on the latter part of it. However you want to look at it, the stocks. I remember, guys, you may not remember, you won't remember it, but I remember teaching from the podium, and I remember the first time coming in on a Sunday, I said, well, who would have ever thought we'd be here? 11,000 points on the stock market. We're at 11,000. We've almost tripled that now. 11,000 was like, woohoo! We're doing good! And now it seems like chump change. In fact, if it falls even 1,000 points, the world goes into this conniption fit of going, oh, we're going to go bankrupt. Not even close. So this power grid right now, all owned by Antichrist, based on him being what? Empowered by whom? Satan, whom is what? Ephesians declare that he's the God of this world, who forgets that the keys were taken from him by Jesus following his death and resurrection. So to some degree, it is a cool analogy that all of these historic empires that have been presented on the scene pale and compared to these, ultimately the empire of God, God's kingdom, and our true king. Verse 37, declared here, he shall regard neither the God of his fathers nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall exalt himself above them. Two important parts here that are disclosed. I think this is important to take note of. The one seems to suggest what his pedigree will be. Will he be Swiss? Will he be American? Will he be Hispanic? Will he be Russian? Will he be Dutch? Will he be Indonesian? What will he be? Italian? The Latins have had a big influence. Will he be Grecian? They wrote the New Testament. Well, actually, this is kind of saying right now, neither regard for the God of his fathers. God of his fathers is Jewish terminology. It implies that he will have Jewish heritage, okay? Jewish heritage. Why is that important? Because the one whom they are waiting in Israel for, Messiah, must be Jewish. In order for him to play in to what it is they want to hear and will believe, he has to be, by heritage, a Jew. They take meticulous pride in being able to say that from nowhere we were gathered from the four corners of the earth and we've lost no one in their genealogy. They know the priesthood from the biblical accounts, and they've kept track of every generation thereafter. Don't know how they did it. They did it. So this is important because Antichrist must have the heritage. That phrase right there is the clue that tells us he will be of Jewish descent. Maybe speaks flawless Hebrew, or he might be very much indeed a multilingualist. And he can speak 7 different languages or 8. Maybe he will speak the commerce of religion. But then he might also be able to speak the language of the sciences. He'll have it all down. Very persuasive. So I want you to notice that, to draw your attention to it. Nor the desire of women. Now this is interesting. I'm going to say this. I'm not meaning to be offensive, but I'm also not wanting to scurf around what could be evidence right now. You know that in terms of mores, that's the term that means morals. The ability to know basically good from evil, right from wrong. What is a standard for behavioral norms? That's another word. You learn those in school. Morals and normatives. It's how we behave, how we ought to evaluate the way things ought to be done. So when we move away from that by putting psychobabble on it and saying, this is the new norm, we're lying against truth. When you're hearing in the political forum, and I had to take a look at this, but one of the accusations that you're hearing, which really makes no sense at all. I think you've heard it. Fired by one political group towards the other, that would be towards Trump. That he's an existential threat. I want you to understand, most of those guys, if they were interviewed, don't even know what they're saying. Existentialism simply is the philosophy that says, a man, a woman, their truth is their truth. It's true. Whatever it is they believe is their truth, that's existentialism. It's everybody being, if you would, a god in their own eyes. Or, as judges would declare, doing what's right according to their own sight, their own interests. That's all it means. But that's become a catchphrase that nobody's even researching right now. Oh, he's an existential threat. Yeah, we've seen that in his language, his behavior, the way he's chumming up to the Jewish people. It's so stupid because if you, excuse me, Mr. ABC News commentator, what does existential mean? Do you know what it means? I don't know, not really, now that you ask me. So that's what it means, and that's what you're hearing. Power to truth, truth to power, right? You're hearing that? Women are using that term in terms of identifying themselves in what now is, I think, moving from that, this Me Too movement revelation that women have been sexualized. There's no doubt about that. But part of it is that everybody has wanted to hold on to their own truth and say, this is what's right. The way that I see it is true. Well, that's an opinion. Might be a philosophy, but it doesn't make it true. So when you've heard that term, you need to understand it plays in to this, where there will be people who now in utter confusion are saying something's going wrong. This is just right on the current scene right now. You know that we've had transgenderism that has been exalted, what? Above norm. That's when a man declares himself to feel pretty, and he's going to dress pretty, and he's going to call himself a woman. That's a lie. The chromosomes within a man or a woman are distinctly identifying them as their gender. And lately you've heard that a doctor has said, yeah, babies actually don't have gender conformity when they're born. It's kind of they move in the direction they want to move at some point in time. Well, that's crazy, because science proves that in fact they are identified as a man or woman at birth, not what they want to become later. So there's been now, which I'm actually glad to hear, there's been a resistance that's forged. I think it's Kentucky, but I honestly don't remember. And what's happening is that men who consider themselves women, though they are young boys, 16, 17, and so forth, are entering into women's sports, and they're just clean and clap. They win in races, it's just like, they wear their tutus, but basically they're men in tutus, and they're just clean clack, and finally there's a resistance saying, no, we're not standing up for this anymore, you're men. And even though you may be on a testosterone suppressant or an estrogen progesterone injection, you're men. You have bigger bones, bigger lungs, and you can really have an attitude trying to take over the sport. So there's resistance, and I'm actually glad to see it. There's a fight going on saying, you're not the same as us. You're not invited to any of our parties anymore. We don't want you. So I think that's been something that's on the headlines and cool. However, one of the things for the first time in history is the overt call to normalcy of homosexuality. So a lot of that's being pronounced in the entertainment industry, but for the first time in politics, a gentleman from Buttigieg, I don't remember where he's mayor from, so at any rate, but he just recently has dropped out of the race. What was one of his selling points? That he was the next person to break a social barrier that ought to be considered normative. And so he has married another man when the Supreme Court ruled on that based on Kennedy's evaluation, which I pray and believe he has repented of in that decision, to create a normative with regard to homosexuality. Buttigieg then comes up on the scene as one who is not apologetic for it. And he also stands strong, and I was a military man and lived through it, and I was, a warrior. So not only was I a warrior, but I'm also homosexual, and I've got both areas to boast in. And I honestly believe that right now, the nation is not ready for that, but it is being primed for it. And when I look at it, I'm going, that would not be difficult then for Antichrist to come on the scene, to have an affection not for women, but to actually have an affection for men, and to be what? On the other side of the psychological spectrum, to appeal to a generation now who do not care about that as an issue, but the ones who have a passion for it, meaning the homosexual community, LGBTQ, WXYZ, whatever they're called, they're going, that's our man. And the other one's going, yeah, he's a man. And they're going, no, he's not really, but he's our man, woman. He's good. And so that barrier is being brought down right now. Just saying, he's the first one to make it on that platform that was able to convey normalcy. He didn't talk. What? The gay tends to talk, the male, what we call fruity language. There's just something about it. We've actually understood, we actually understand better now that actually it's a language learned. It's a language learned. It's just like, if I were to ask some of you guys to impersonate some guy in the hood, you'd be able to come close to it. There was a language, by the way, and I know I'm deviating just a little bit, but I'm trying to show you that in this collision of culture and people declaring their own truth, it's had an effect that has really been of great consequence. There was a language that came from the black community, and it later on generated a call to have it taught in school. It was called Ebonics. But it was literally a cultural swagger from the black community, young guys on the, whatever you call them, the lower end of education. They began to come up with terminology that later on got employed in rap music. And so educators said, yeah, we need to learn this and teach it to our kids, and we ought to all learn how to speak Ebonics. And it was basically black slang. We need to learn how to speak black slang. Why? I'm having trouble just jumping over the curveball of white slang. Why do I want to learn that? And so the call to have education bilingual. All of these things have been done ultimately to make us what? A global society. Globalism. I still disagree highly in that move to make us a bilingual nation. You can learn another language, great. But there is one language nationally that we, right now, are to be focused on. There's actually one language as Christians that we are to be focused on. We don't need to get multi-language skills on understanding other forms of religion. We have one. So if you want to really know how it works, then understand what God has revealed in the translation that is in our tongue. And then understand, if you need to, the nuance of historical Jewish language and historical Greek language. If you want to go beyond that, great. But don't try to make it into this global thing. And that's, by the way, one of the things we're seeing in Bible versions today. We must have over 100 different Bible versions today. Everybody trying to improve on the last improvement. And what does that lead us to? No improvement. It doesn't. So let me jump back into this. But please note that that's the implication right now. He will be Jewish in ancestry, and very likely he will be gay in his preferences. No preferences for women, but right now the door is being opened up in which that's going to be considered, live and let live. No problem there. We're good. He's good. So just something to consider. 38. In their place he shall honor a god of fortresses and a god which his fathers did not know. He shall honor with gold, silver, and precious stones. So again, the God of his fathers, Jewish again linking it, and shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. So this could imply what his emphasis will be in terms of appeasing the communities that we talked about. Okay, the three communities that we talked about was that which was stationed in Rome, which has an implication different than Babylon, which has an implication different than Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the spiritual capital, Rome, the political capital, Babylon, the commercial capital, that he would be into building things. One type that we would have that would say, has anybody set up that kind of template before? Yes. The very book that we're reading set up the template of man's desire to build for himself, only himself. So Nebuchadnezzar, classic. Rome, classic. Greek, classic. These are all nations that who, as they rose to fame, built a legacy in construct. We marvel at some of the ruins. The Jewish people, when you walk around these areas, you go, man, they really were awesome builders. And they were. They just got vanquished and destroyed so many multiple times. It's layers and layers upon building projects. But it could indicate that this, in fact, is what he will be. He will be impressively noted as calling in the finest resources available to build the biggest structures, which represents basically his heart in those three different areas. Religion, which is false religion. Government, which will be defiled. It'll be corrupt, a corrupt government. It'll go after people maliciously. It'll kill people wantingly, heinously, when he comes on the scene. And then a commerce that will operate corruptingly in Babylon. So when you see him in governance, he's not going to be man's friend during that time. Blood will flow. He'll be responsible and the justifier of it. 39, I'm going to just jump down there. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge, and advance its glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain. This indicates, very likely right now, the implication here is the 10-nation confederacy that will join him over basically his vision for the world system. That probably is the implication here. In verse 40 through the close, 45, at the time of the end of the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen, with many ships, and he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. Now, this implication would seem to me describing the event that happens in the midpoint of the 7-year period. This is the last portion of what we would call the tribulation period. Because why? He's friends with everybody in the first portion. But once he moves against Jerusalem and once he goes after persecuting, which it is going to happen somewhere in between on that first mark, 3.5 years. Because he has to clean up those who are resisting him, those who are not taking the mark. But it would indicate that there's a confederacy that's already forged right now who will see to his will being worked out. And he shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. So to some degree, this might explain some of those who in what would be called the pagan Middle Eastern, Near Eastern faiths, the ones that are surrounding this area, will become those who align themselves with Israel, and they're going to escape. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. And he shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans, the Ethiopians, shall follow at his heels. This indicates also perhaps the north and south. But we know that Russia is going to be more pronounced in the book of Revelation. This indicates that basically the world system as it is known will be in upheaval over this guy. Upheaval. And it also implies that right now there's a final battle that's going to be displayed. That battle is in the valley of Jezreel. That battle also known as Armageddon in the valley of Megiddo. So if you've been there, or you will, it's inarguable. It looks like a battle plan. It's hard for me to do the numbers because, when even I was mentioning historically that when Ptolemy was battling. And they're talking about 100,000 warriors left behind. That's 4,000 I can say, okay, captives of war, I can see that. But when you're talking about 100,000, I don't know what it looks like. It's hard for me. But this valley will contain even more territory than that figure. When we realize, and I've heard this, that China has a standing army of 1 million men, I'm going, okay, 100,000. I can't even imagine that. How can I imagine 1 million men of just one nation? But somehow China and Russia are going to play into this. And it's beyond my imagination. I don't get how it all works. So this right now closes a chapter in which what we see, because 12 is just it's a whisper. It tells you that in a summation, Antichrist who moves in on this period of time will have a moment of fame, a claim to fame, but he's going to be held, indicted by the Lord, who will come in and challenge, obviously, him, and throw him and the false prophet and ultimately Satan to be bound for 1,000 years. They get judged and toasted quickly. Satan will squirm around for 1,000 years to be released. And I don't even get that one. I don't know if it's going to be like 1,000 years. We're going to go, what's that smell? Huh? You have problems here? And it will be that he will be released, but he will be instantaneously judged following one last opportunity to deceive those who have remained in 1,000 years of peace and righteousness with God. And you're asking yourself, how could anybody be deceived by that stinky guy? Maybe he's not going to stink like we think. Maybe he's going to have this brilliant light that will seduce. But at any rate, it closes basically the portal of history right now, earthly history, in what is a battle of the heart and for the soul. And therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. This is Antichrist making his last effort to pull his global institutions together. And he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end. This, very likely, verse 45 is describing Megiddo. Okay? That area between the Mediterranean and where we're at presently. His palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. No one can help him. He's had his time. His fame concludes. So I'm going to close on this and have an early dismissal today. Go to Revelation 1, and then flip over, because Revelation 1 and Revelation 2 are the descriptions of the church. Very important to note that those are the personalities of the churches defined. And you can find yourself, hopefully, in two of them. A persecuted soul and a loving soul. Philadelphia is the loving church. Smyrna is the persecuted church. Hopefully that's where you say, that's where I'm at. Oh, from time to time, I definitely hear the Lord wooing me back to him. I definitely have an Ephesians heart at times. And Ephesus needs to just, I need to break that contract with Ephesus. I need to always return to my first love. So, but this is where we find it in verse 1 of chapter 4. And after these things I looked, and behold, the door standing open in heaven, and the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet speaking with me, saying, Come up here, and I will show you things which must take place after this. We know that the Apostle John is penning this in exile. He's hearing this voice, but he, in this case, is a type. Remember we talked about types? He's a type of the church. Daniel, in some moments of his ministry with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, his brothers, he was a type of the church. And he's actually still a type of the church now, prevailing in a pagan culture beautifully, and giving revelation about God. We are prevailing in primarily a pagan culture, beautifully giving revelation of God. as Daniel was one who with great enthusiasm represented the church, and as John, who with great clarity gives us revelation of the church, and how you and I as well are to give revelation and beauty about the church, we have to declare to one another and to others the victory that God has given us. I mean, for me, I could have gone down and cracked my head. I didn't. I could have broken my wrist, and I thought, man, that would have taken me out of worship, and it didn't happen. But I did go down hard, and I got up, and I just marveled at how God just did that for me. There was no doubt that I had an accident, but I arose from the accident to have at least one more chance, to go whatever, one more day. And that's essentially right now the motivation in this conclusion for chapter 12 is that entering into chapter 12, he's written the conclusion for you to be highly motivated right now. Antichrist is coming, but you don't need to fear him. It may sound dizzying, all these details, but you don't have to break your bones trying, to get to the bottom of this, to try and figure it out. It's been secured in the Word, and just that opening statement right now is enough to share with you that in the component parts of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul identifies that to a church that was questioning, and I think we looked at it a couple days ago. This is the way it's going to happen. This is the way God's going to call you out. And when you're called out, you're called out. When you're called out, then the things that must take place on this earth shall be satisfied according to my word. So the unveiling of Revelation is simply how God's going to bring better understanding. But there's still some mystery. Definitely what you will see and hear are names right yet that Daniel wasn't able to focus on. He's still kind of in Syria and Africa and Jerusalem and the Mediterranean and Greece. He's got those in mind of his world. John will have other things that relate to what would be the new Roman Empire better defined, but also how does Russia and China play into this mapping of the world scene? Because they're big players, super big players. And so what is this Putin doing? Man, how long has he been around? He's been around a long time. He was under the entirety of the Bush administration. Medvedev might have been in there for just a brief 2 years, I'm thinking. So he's going on a long time. Netanyahu is the oldest serving prime minister of Israel. Now, to me, I'm going, yay! That's awesome. And it sounds like he had a victory. And the reason I say that is because he is very astute. He's a gifted man, and he is a hawk for Israel. He's not passive. He does not appease the forces that are against Israel. He meets them on the battlefield. When there's an attack, he sends out and dispatches the Israeli Defense Force. He goes after them. He does not give territory. And you can actually see him by increments take over the land which God has given to Israel. Because I personally, I have to be careful because I don't know this with certainty. I believe at least he's a Bible-believing believer in terms of this is God's nation. This is God's land. God has given it to God's people. We're going after it. How wonderful it would be if there could be a connection in which we literally hear Netanyahu as a believer. I'd have to do some research on that. Can't say that he's a believer in Jesus, but how wonderful that would be if all of a sudden he and Pence and, hey, let's have a phone tag and invite each other into a prayer meeting. Wouldn't that blow the nation temperament to pieces? What did they do? Yeah, they had a three-way phone call. Pence and Trump and Netanyahu. They had a prayer meeting. They were broadcasting it. They were praying for the nations. And they were praying for the work that God wants to do through the church. So we're going to close there.